Come, see the place where the Lord lay. This was the invitation given to Mary Magdalene and the other women on the morning of the resurrection. They came to mourn, to weep, to grieve over the loss of the one they loved. But what they found was not sorrow, but victory. Spurgeon, in his sermon, The Tomb of Jesus, beautifully describes how every moment of Christ's life carries deep meaning, from his birth in a manger to his suffering on the cross. But he lingers on one particular moment, the grave. Why? Because even in death, Jesus was accomplishing something beyond human understanding. There is something deeply moving about standing before an empty tomb. Imagine that moment. The heavy stone rolled away, the grave clothes lying there neatly folded, the silence, the air still holding the memory of death, but no death remains. Joseph of Arimathea had lent his own tomb for Jesus to be buried, a borrowed grave for the Son of God, but it would not be needed for long. The earth could not hold the one who created it. Pause for a moment, let this sink in. Jesus truly died. He did not faint, he was not merely wounded. His heart stopped beating, his body was wrapped in cloth, and he was sealed in a cold, dark tomb. For 3 days the world thought it had won, but on the third day everything changed. Spurgeon says, "Come, see the place where the Lord lay." Why does he invite us here? Because there is power in the tomb, not in its darkness but in its emptiness. If you have ever felt abandoned, if you have ever tasted grief, if you have ever walked through deep sorrow, you are not alone. Jesus himself walked through death, so that death would not have the final word. But this is only the beginning of the story. The grave is meant to be the final resting place of every person. It is the great equalizer. Whether rich or poor, strong or weak, all eventually find themselves in the dust. But there was one grave that could not hold its occupant. Joseph of Arimathea, a wealthy disciple of Jesus, offered his own tomb for the burial of Christ. This was a significant moment, fulfilling the prophecy. He was assigned a grave with the wicked, but with the rich in his death. Spurgeon, in his sermon, The Tomb of Jesus, paints a vivid picture of this scene. He describes how Jesus, though treated like a criminal in his death, was buried with honor in a rich man's tomb. It was as if heaven itself refused to let the Son of God be discarded like an ordinary prisoner. But why does this matter? Because it shows us that even the grave, the place of finality, was not the end for Jesus. Imagine the weight of that stone as it was rolled over the entrance. The soldiers standing guard, ensuring no one could enter. The silence that followed. It seemed like death had won. But 3 days later, that same grave stood empty. The very thing meant to keep Jesus in the ground became proof of his victory. Pause for a moment. Let this truth settle in your heart. When you stand at the grave of a loved one, when you face your own mortality, does fear grip you? The world sees death as the end, but Jesus proved otherwise. Spurgeon reminds us, "Come, see the place where the Lord lay." Not because he is still there, but because his absence changes everything. Death had a claim on him, but it could not hold him. The grave thought it had won, but it had only been borrowed. And if death could not keep Jesus, then it will not keep those who belong to him. The tomb of Jesus was no ordinary grave. It was not merely a resting place for a man who had lived a good life and died a noble death. It was a battlefield, the site of the greatest spiritual transaction in history. Why was Jesus there? Because of sin. Not his sin, for he had none, but ours. Spurgeon reminds us, he was there because of our transgressions. The tomb is our debt, and Christ in his love paid it in full. The weight of sin is something we cannot fully comprehend. We often see sin as individual actions, lies, anger, pride, impurity. But sin is much more than that. It is separation from God. It is the disease of humanity, inherited from Adam. It is the force that brings death into the world. And death always demands payment. The wages of sin is death. That is why the grave exists. That is why tombstones fill the earth, why the strongest bodies grow weak, why the greatest minds fade into silence. Sin demands that we die. But Jesus stepped into that grave in our place. He willingly took the full weight of sin upon himself, bearing it all on the cross before being laid in the tomb. He himself bore our sins in his body on the tree. Imagine for a moment the overwhelming burden he carried. Every sin ever committed, every selfish act, every cruel word, every hidden thought of darkness pressed down upon him. The guilt of the murderer, the shame of the adulterer, the bitterness of the betrayed. All of it. And when it was finished, when every drop of God's wrath had been poured out, his body was taken down, wrapped in linen, and placed in the cold silence of the tomb. The one who gave life to the world was now lifeless. The hands that had healed the sick were now still. The feet that had walked on water were now bound in burial cloth. The voice that had called Lazarus from the grave was now silent. Pause for a moment, let that sink in. The disciples must have been crushed by sorrow, their hope gone, their teacher dead. They had seen him raise others from the dead, but now he was the one in the grave. The weight of sin had done its worst. It had dragged him into death. It had closed the tomb. It had won. Or so it seemed. The morning after the Sabbath was filled with sorrow. The women who had followed Jesus came to the tomb, carrying spices to anoint his body. Their hearts were heavy, their eyes swollen from weeping. But as they approached, something was wrong. The stone, that heavy, immovable stone, had been rolled away. Fear gripped them. Who had done this? Had someone taken his body? Their sorrow now mixed with confusion. But as they stepped closer, a voice called out, "Why do you seek the living among the dead? He is not here, he is risen." These words, spoken by angels, changed history forever. Spurgeon, in his sermon, The Tomb of Jesus, describes this moment with reverence. "Come, see the place where the Lord lay, not where he lies, but where he lay. He is gone, for death could not hold him. The grave is now a witness, not of defeat, but of victory." The women must have struggled to comprehend what they were hearing. Their last memory of Jesus was of a broken, bleeding body taken down from the cross. Yet now, the grave was empty. Pause for a moment. Imagine standing in their place. What would you have felt? Would your heart race with hope, or would doubt creep in? The angels had delivered the greatest news the world had ever received. Jesus was not stolen. Jesus was not defeated. Jesus was alive. The tomb, which had swallowed so many before him, could not keep him. The women, trembling yet filled with new hope, ran to tell the disciples. But they struggled to believe. The grave had been sealed. Soldiers had been stationed outside. How could he be alive? But this is what makes the resurrection so powerful. It was impossible. No human effort could have brought Jesus back. No religious ritual could have restored his breath. No earthly power could have undone what had happened on the cross. Yet the impossible had happened. The angel's message is for us today, just as it was for them. Why do you seek the living among the dead? Are you searching for hope in empty places? Are you looking for life in things that only bring death? Are you holding on to sorrow when victory has already been won? Come, see the place where the Lord lay, and realize he is not there. The tomb was empty, Jesus was gone, but one detail remained, a small yet profound sign left behind. The grave clothes were still there. When Peter and John ran to the tomb after hearing the women's report, they found not only an empty grave, but something unusual. The linen wrappings that had covered Jesus' body were lying in place, and the napkin that had been around his head was neatly folded, set apart from the rest. Pause for a moment. This was no chaotic scene. No grave robbery had taken place. No one had hastily unwrapped his body and carried him away. Instead, everything was left in order. Spurgeon, in his sermon, The Tomb of Jesus, sees great meaning in this small detail. The grave clothes were left behind, for Jesus had no more need of them. He had conquered death and cast aside its garments forever. The napkin, carefully folded, was a message to his disciples. I am coming back. Think about this. If Jesus had struggled to rise, or if his body had been taken, the cloths would have been disturbed, tossed aside. But no, they were left as a testimony. Death had no power over him. Imagine Peter and John standing there, staring at those folded linens. It must have struck them. Jesus had left the grave deliberately, calmly, victoriously. The folded napkin also carried a cultural message. In Jewish tradition, when a master finished eating, he would crumple his napkin and toss it onto the table, a sign that he was done. But if he folded it neatly and placed it aside, it meant something else. I'm coming back. Jesus did not leave the tomb in defeat. He left it in triumph, and the folded cloth was a quiet declaration. The story is not over. Pause again, let that settle in. What does this mean for us today? It means Jesus left the grave not just for himself, but for us. The grave that was once our greatest enemy has been stripped of its power. Have you ever felt trapped in hopelessness, like your life is wrapped in the cloth of failure, regret, or fear? Jesus left those grave clothes behind, and so should we. The resurrection is not just a historical event, it is an invitation. An invitation to step out of the tombs we have built around ourselves. An invitation to leave behind the burdens of sin, shame, and despair. An invitation to walk in newness of life. Spurgeon says, "Come, see the place where the Lord lay, not in mourning but in joy. For what once held him holds him no more." The empty tomb is proof that our past does not define us. That death is not the end. That hope is alive. The grave is a symbol of finality. It is the one place no one returns from. It is the great divider between life and death, between hope and despair. But when Jesus walked out of that tomb, he shattered the power of the grave forever. Spurgeon, in his sermon, "The Tomb of Jesus," declares, "The grave thought it had won, but when Christ burst forth in power, he turned it into a gateway of glory. O death, where is your sting? O grave, where is your victory?" Imagine the moment of resurrection. The silence of the tomb suddenly broken. The body, once lifeless, now breathing again. The stone, meant to keep him in, rolled away with effortless power. Death had done its worst, yet it failed. Pause, think about what this means. Before Jesus, death was the ultimate fear. No one could escape it. Kings and beggars alike were swallowed by its cold grip. But now the tomb stands empty, a permanent testimony that death is no longer master over those who belong to Christ. He is risen, just as he said. Spurgeon beautifully explains, his resurrection is the guarantee of our own. As he walked out of that tomb, so shall we. The grave may take us, but it will not keep us. Can you grasp the magnitude of this truth? Think of every loved one you have lost, every tear shed over a grave, every moment when death seemed to have the final word. But now everything has changed. Death is not the end, it is only a doorway. For those who trust in Christ, the grave is not a prison, it is a place of transformation. The body may rest in the dust for a time, but it will rise again, glorified and eternal. I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live. This is why Christians do not fear death. This is why martyrs faced execution with peace. This is why saints on their deathbeds spoke of joy instead of dread. This is why Spurgeon himself, nearing the end of his life, said, "I long to see the face of him who conquered the grave." And this is why you, no matter what trials you face, can have unshakable hope. The stone was rolled away not so Jesus could get out, but so we could see in. The empty tomb changes everything. Let that truth settle in your heart. Let it change the way you live. No one wants to think about death, yet it comes for us all. It is the one appointment we cannot cancel, the one reality we cannot escape. The strongest bodies will grow weak. The sharpest minds will fade. The ones we love will one day be laid in the ground, and we too will follow. But for those who belong to Christ, death is not the end. Spurgeon, in The Tomb of Jesus, speaks of this with great certainty. Come see the place where the Lord lay and realize this truth. Where he was, you shall be. But fear not, for as he rose, so shall you. Pause. Let that sink in. Have you ever stood at the grave of someone you love? Have you ever felt the weight of loss, the sting of finality? The world tells us death is the end, but the empty tomb of Jesus tells a different story. If we die with him, we will also live with him. For the believer, the grave is not a prison. It is a temporary resting place. Just as Jesus was laid in the tomb, so will we. But just as Jesus rose, so shall we. This is the great hope of the resurrection. When we close our eyes in this world, we will open them in glory. When our bodies return to dust, God will raise them anew, incorruptible and eternal. Spurgeon reminds us, the tomb of Christ is the Christian's triumph. We do not go to the grave in despair. We go knowing that it is but a doorway into life everlasting. Death is still painful. Losing those we love still brings sorrow. But now sorrow is mixed with hope. The world sees a coffin and mourns. The believer sees a grave and knows, this is not the end. Imagine for a moment the day when all will rise. The graves will open. The bodies once broken by disease, suffering, and time will stand whole and glorified. The ones who were lost to us will be restored. The last enemy to be destroyed is death. And it will be destroyed. There will be no more funerals, no more mourning, no more parting, only life. So do not fear. Do not weep without hope. The grave that could not hold Jesus will not hold you either. If the resurrection was just a historical event, it would be impressive, but not life-changing. If Jesus had risen only to return to heaven and leave us as we were, it would be a miracle to admire, but not a reality to transform us. But that is not what happened. The resurrection is not just something we believe, it is something we live. Spurgeon, in The Tomb of Jesus, declares, "The risen Christ is not merely a figure of history. He is the living one, still working, still saving, still transforming. If he is risen, then let us rise with him." Pause. Let that truth settle in your heart. We do not serve a dead teacher. We do not follow a buried prophet. We worship a living king. And if Jesus is alive, then nothing in our lives can remain the same. The same power that raised him from the dead now works in us. This means the sins that once enslaved you have no hold on you anymore. The fears that once controlled you no longer have the final word. The doubts that whispered, "You are alone," have been silenced by the voice of the risen Christ. "I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me, though he may die, he shall live." Spurgeon reminds us, Christian, you have already died with Christ. Why do you live as though you are still bound by the grave? Rise and walk in the newness of life. The resurrection is not just about what happens when we die. It is about how we live right now. If Christ has conquered sin, why do we live as though sin still rules us? If Christ has conquered death, why do we live in fear of the future? If Christ has risen, why do we live as though hope is lost? Pause. Think. The tomb is empty, so why do we live as if we are still buried? This is the call of the resurrection, not just to believe, but to rise. To step out of the graves of our past. To leave behind the darkness of sin and shame. To walk in victory, knowing that death has already been defeated. This is not a future promise, it is a present reality. Spurgeon says, "Come, see the place where the Lord lay, not to mourn but to rejoice. He is not there, and because he lives, so do we. Live like the grave is empty. Because it is. Come see." The invitation is simple, yet it holds the weight of eternity. The angels did not roll away the stone so Jesus could leave. They rolled it away so we could look inside, so that we could stand at the mouth of an empty grave and know, this changes everything. Spurgeon in The Tomb of Jesus gives this final call. Come, see the place where the Lord lay, not in sorrow but in victory. Come, and let your faith be strengthened. Come, and let your fears be buried where he once lay. Pause. Think about what this means. If the tomb is empty, then God's promises are true. If the tomb is empty, then sin has been defeated. If the tomb is empty, then death is no longer to be feared. But if the tomb is empty, why do so many live as though Jesus is still in it? Why do we carry the weight of sin as if he did not already bear it? Why do we live in fear as if the grave still has power over us? Why do we mourn without hope when the risen Christ stands victorious? Because I live, you also will live. This is not just a comforting verse, it is the foundation of our faith. It is the reason we wake up each day with hope. It is the power that turns sorrow into joy, fear into courage, death into life. The tomb is empty, but the story is not over. One day, all will see what the disciples saw. Every eye will behold the risen King. Every knee will bow before the one who conquered the grave. And on that day, for those who have trusted him, there will be no fear, no sorrow, no death. Only life. Spurgeon calls us not just to see the empty tomb, but to respond to it. Come, see the place where the Lord lay, and never be the same again. Pause. Let that settle in your soul. The grave is empty. Now how will you live?